14 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 12 defenses I'm ranking this week here. As many teams are trying to get into the playoffs, so obviously try to get a bye as well. The first defense is the Denver Broncos. So the Broncos here in week 14 got a great matchup with the Detroit Lions coming to Denver here. And this Bronco team, I know they've been hit or miss on defense this season, but I'm going with matchup, and I'm going that they're at home as well for picking them number one this week. So the last few weeks here for Denver. Week 10 versus Philly, 24 points allowed, a sack in it though. Week 12 versus the Chargers, 13 points allowed, 3 sacks, 2 went those, a touchdown. And then week 13 in a tough matchup at Kansas City. Obviously they didn't do much, but only 16 points allowed, a sack and an int though. So right here, week 14 versus the Lions, I think they could get a couple interceptions. It wouldn't surprise me to see them find the end zone. And this team here, believe it or not, they're still in the hunt here in the AFC is Denver. So right now with the home game and a weak Lion offense, I think they have a big game this week and possibly could be number one on the rankings for defense. Number 2, the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans got a good matchup here in week 14 versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. That early in the season, they had a huge fantasy day. 19 points allowed, 2 sacks, an into fumble recovery, and a touchdown in that one. And the last few weeks here, I know this defense hasn't played good, but they're coming off the bye now in week 13. In Jacksonville, they're not moving the football good. They give up the third most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And right now, Trevor Lawrence, he's just not finding it. He's not scoring touchdowns. He's not putting up big numbers. And this whole team as a whole just can't move the football. Running or passing is this Jacksonville team. So I think the Titans here, they got to bounce back with a big victory. It's going to start with the defense in this one. And I think they could find the end zone or hold this Jacksonville team anywhere from 7 to 13 points. So right here, I like them number 2 this week. The third defense, the Green Bay Packers. So the Packers, they got added in 50% of fantasy leagues as the waiver wire period ended. And they got a great matchup here in week 14 versus the Bears that give up the 7th most fantasy points to defenses. And the good news here is for this Packer defense, Justin Fields is starting. I know Andy Dalton last week had a bad ball game versus the Arizona Cardinals, throwing 4 interceptions. But Justin Fields, in my opinion, he's just not really a quarterback. He's more of a guy that's looking to run at this point, and he holds on to the ball too long. So the last few games here for Green Bay, week 10 versus Seattle, 3 sacks, 2 went those, a shutout in that one. Week 11 in Minnesota, a down ball game in that one, 34 points allowed, 2 sacks. And then week 12 versus the Rams, a good ball game for this Packer defense, 28 points allowed, 2 sacks in it though, 2 fumble recoveries and a touchdown. So with a good matchup here in week 14 and them coming off the bye, I think they have a big game here as Green Bay. And they've been one of the better defenses, believe it or not, all season in fantasy football. The next defense, the Los Angeles Chargers. So the Chargers last week, their defense came and played at the Cincinnati Bengals with a 41-22 victory in that week 13 matchup. The last few weeks, besides that game, the defense hasn't been good though. Week 11 versus Pittsburgh, 37 points allowed, 3 sacks. Week 12 at Denver, 22 points allowed, a sack and an int though. But right here in week 14, they got a great matchup versus the New York Giants that give up the 12th most fantasy points to defenses. And last week at Cincinnati, the big game, they had 22 points allowed, 6 sacks, 2 int those, 2 fumble recoveries, and a touchdown. And the other thing is here, Jake Fromm starting for this Giant team. So Daniel Jones is out with the neck strain. Mike Glennon, he got banged up with the concussion, and he didn't look good anyway versus the Miami Dolphins. So right here, I think this Charger team feasts versus a weak New York Giant offense with most of their main weapons injured. And with Jake Fromm, who's pretty much an unknown at the quarterback position, I don't see him doing much versus this defense. And I think this Charger defense definitely has a top 5 performance, but I got them at number 4. Number 5, the Kansas City Chiefs. So the Chiefs here, their defense has been outperforming their offense, in my opinion, over the last month of the season. But this Chief team, they got off to the slow start at 3-4 on the year. Now they've won 5 games in a row, and that starts with the defense, no doubt about it. Week 9 versus Green Bay, 7 points allowed, sack, interception, fumble recovery, a block kick. Week 10 at the Vegas Raiders, 14 points allowed, 2 sacks, an int though fumble recovery. Week 11 versus Dallas, 9 points allowed, 5 sacks, 2 int those. And then week 13 versus Denver, what a ball game on Sunday Night Football. 9 points, a sack, 2 int those in that one, including a pick 6 and a fumble recovery in that ball game with only 9 points allowed. So right here, another matchup versus AFC West competitor and rival, the Las Vegas Raiders. And like I mentioned in Week 10 versus this Raider team, they played good defense as Kansas City. Like I said, 14 points allowed, 2 sacks, and an into with a fumble recovery. And Derek Carr, he's too Jekyll and Hyde for me here. So I think Carr in this ball game doesn't do much, especially in Kansas City. And I think this Chief team has a good game this week. Number 6, the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints, their defense has teed it off a little over the last few weeks, but they got an amazing matchup week 14 at the New York Jets here that give up the 4th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few weeks, like I mentioned, for New Orleans, not much of anything, but they've had tough matchups as well. Week 11 at Philly, 34 points allowed, 3 sacks, fumble recovery. Week 12 versus Buffalo, 31 points allowed, 2 sacks to win those. And week 13 versus Dallas, in my opinion, they played a pretty decent game versus a high-powered offense. 21 points allowed, a sack and an interception. So that game was close until the 4th quarter where the Dallas defense took over and got a few windows. So right here at Zach Wilson in the New York Jets, I think this Saint defense are going to make some plays, and they just do. They've lost 5 games in a row here, and I think versus this weak Jet offense and Zach Wilson, who hasn't been this great this rookie year, they make a few plays in this game and will be number 6. Number 7, I got this week's the Seattle Seahawks. So this Seahawks defense is a 1-week top 7 play this week, and they got a great matchup at the Houston Texans here, Seattle. I mentioned them early in the week on my starts at the defense position. So the last few games here for Seattle, Week 11 versus Arizona, 23 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 12 at Washington, 17 points, a sack, an into block kick, and an extra point return. And then Week 13 versus San Francisco, they had a great game, 23 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery, a safety, and a return punt for a fake punt for a touchdown. So right here, great matchup at the Houston Texans that give up the 2nd most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And Tyrod Taylor, in my opinion, he's pretty much washed up and not that great of a quarterback. Yeah, he'll have some games here and there, but I think this week, once again, he don't do much. And the Seattle defense got added in 25% of fantasy leagues, so I think they could get a few sacks. I think they could do a few things on special teams as well, which his defense has been doing the last few weeks. And I like them in number 7. Number 8, the Carolina Panthers. So the Panthers, their defense has been hit or miss for the most part this season. But this week here, the numbers don't lie, and the matchup is great versus the Atlanta Falcons that give up the most fantasy points to defenses. Matt Ryan, it's been trouble for him this season, especially ever since Calvin Ridley's been out of the lineup and Julio Jones traded away in the offseason. So the last few games here for the Panthers, DST. Week 10 at Arizona, 10 points allowed, 4 sacks, and into fumble recovery. Week 11 versus Washington, 27 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. And Week 12 in Miami, 33 points allowed, 2 sacks, and a fumble recovery. Obviously, not a good ball game, but right here, great matchup. Coming off the bye is this Panther team. And this Panther team, they've been in a tailspin, but I think this week here, they're due for a good game, and they're due for a good defensive game as well. Number 9, the Baltimore Ravens. So the Ravens, the defense is getting better over the last few weeks, but their offense hasn't been that great the last couple weeks here is Baltimore. So their defense has had to do most of the work. In Week 14, another matchup at the Cleveland Browns that we saw in Week 12 versus Cleveland. Only 10 points allowed, 3 sacks, and 2 fumble recoveries for this Raven DST. Week 11 at Chicago for them, 13 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. And then Week 13 in a tough loss at Pittsburgh, 20 points allowed and a sack. So right here, Week 14 at Cleveland, they give up the 13th most fantasy points is Cleveland. But right here, I don't see this Cleveland offense moving the ball much. I know Nick Chubb's been back. I know Kareem Hunt's been back. Really hasn't done much either here for this Cleveland Brown team. So right here, this Brown team's been struggling. Baker Mayfield, he really hasn't had a good season at all here. And I think this Baltimore Raven team could get to Baker once again. This ball game definitely could be a low-scoring, grinded-out game, anywhere from 13 points to 21 from both teams. And I think the Ravens in this one will win this ball game and will have a good defensive performance. So I got the Ravens at number 9. Number 10, I got the Cleveland Browns staying in the same game. So this Cleveland Brown defense, they got a pretty nice front four this season. But the defense, they've been underwhelming as well. But like I said, this is going to be a tight ball game between the two teams. And in their Week 12 matchup at Baltimore, they had a good game with this Brown defense. 16 points allowed, 2 sacks and 4 interceptions. And right now, Lamar Jackson, he's not playing good football. He's just throwing the ball up for grabs, I feel like, including last week a back foot throw in that game versus Pittsburgh where he threw an interception in the end zone. So Jackson, he's been taking big hits. He's not in rhythm right now with anyone besides maybe Mark Andrews. And right here, the Baltimore Ravens do give up the 9th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few games for Cleveland, 10 points allowed in Week 11 versus Detroit and 2 win those. And then, like I mentioned, Week 12, a good game at Baltimore. So coming off the bye here in Week 13 and with a good matchup versus the Baltimore Ravens, once again, this is going to be a defensive battle, and I think the Browns could have a top 10 performance this week. Number 11, the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Steelers go into Thursday Night Football versus the Minnesota Vikings. And I know the Vikings in Minnesota, they've been good this season and give up the second least amount of fantasy points to defenses. But the Steelers defense, for the most part, the last few weeks has been pretty decent. And Minnesota, they're most likely going to be out without Dalvin Cook. And already Adam Thielen ruled out as well in this game. So the last few weeks here for Pittsburgh, Week 11 at the Chargers, 41 points allowed, 2 sacks in it though, and a block kick. Week 12 versus Cincinnati, a horrible ball game, 35 points allowed in that one, 2 sacks in it though. And last week they did a good job, a great job I should say, versus Lamar in this Raven offense. 19 points allowed, 7 sacks, and an interception. So I think they could put heat on Kirk Cousins early and often. We know Kirk Cousins isn't a primetime quarterback, and without one of his main weapons and possibly his running back as well in this game, it's going to be a long game for Kirk Cousins. And I think the Steelers could carve out a decent ball game, anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points. And the 12th and final defense, I'm ranking this week's the San Francisco 49ers, so the San Fran Niners here. They've been a bend but don't break type of defense here. But last week they didn't have a great game at Seattle. But this week here, Week 14 at Cincinnati, a decent matchup versus the Bengals in Cincy that give up the 15th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few games here for San Francisco, Week 11 at Jacksonville, 10 points allowed, 3 sacks, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 12 versus Minnesota, 26 points allowed, a sack, and into fumble recovery. And then Week 13 at Seattle, they did give up 28 points, but had 4 sacks and into and 2 fumble recoveries. So we know Joe Burrow isn't 100% with that bad pinky that dislocated, but he's a gamer, is Joe Burrow, and he fought it off in that Week 13 loss versus the Chargers. But right here, I think Frisco could get to Joe Burrow a few times. And Burrow, he eyes down Jamar Chase too much for my liking, so that's where the mistakes come in. And also with the bad pinky, he could have some ball security problems. So I think San Francisco can make a few plays this game, and they're going to crack the top 12. So that's the top 12 defenses I'm ranking here for Week 14 of the fantasy football season.